Good day, Thomas Jefferson Hour podcast listeners. Thanks so much for listening, and thank you for supporting the show. We appreciate it. If you'd like to support the show or contact the show, go to jeffersonhour.com, and you can learn about Clay's cultural tours and upcoming events on his schedule at the website. I know you have a big one, a France tour coming up this fall that I'm sure you want to mention again. But this week's one-on-one conversation is with Derek Baxter, who has written a new book that you ordered immediately, you said.
I did. The minute I got an alert, Jefferson in Europe, I ordered it. I'm working on a project involving Jefferson and the Italian humanist Beccaria. Beccaria wrote a famous treatise on crimes and punishments that Jefferson was fond of and Jefferson used. So I'm working with a group on a dialogue between Beccaria and Jefferson that's going to actually premiere in Milan sometime in late 2022 or early 2023. And I'm leading this Jefferson tour of France coming up this fall. People can find out more about that at jeffersonhour.com. But when I saw this, I thought, okay, I've got to read this book and find out more. It's an interesting, fascinating account of a family traveling in the footsteps of Jefferson to all of the countries that he visited in Europe, including England with its 19 splendid landscape gardens that Jefferson had to inspect with John Adams. And it's a breezy book. It's well written. It's accurate. It wrestles with slavery at one point, but he talks about what it meant to travel in this era. And it's not travel the way we understand it, David. It was a much more informal and primitive system of travel, but a decision that Jefferson made almost immediately was not to take an entourage. He's a statesman. He could have taken 2 or 3 people with him. He went more or less incognito. He never announced himself as the American minister to France. He just wanted to be as obscure as possible because he felt that way he would be able to observe better, and that his view wouldn't be tainted by formal dinners and receptions and the key to the city and speeches that he would have to give and high-level meetings with mayors and aldermen and so on. He just wanted to see it. And about that time, he wrote a famous set of instructions for young people traveling in Europe, which still are spot on. In fact, Derek Baxter and I went through them, and they are a great formula for enlightened tourism today.
Well, you have really expanded the subject material in the past weeks on the Jefferson Hour, talking to so many interesting individuals. But this week, it's all about Jefferson.
Every time you think you're at tilt with Jefferson, or that you know what there is to know about Jefferson, or you've got Jefferson, it turns out that's not true, David. There's so much to him, and he's a Renaissance man. And a book like this just reminds you of what a truly extraordinary human being this was, with just deep and wide curiosity. And he knew a fair amount about virtually everything. And he wrote with great precision and elegance. And he had a very enlightened worldview, except, of course, for the issue of slavery. And to read a book like this and to watch him working his way around Paris and maneuvering through France and taking notes on vineyards and inspecting people's kitchens and wanting to make sure he was learning the lesson of Europe. What's the lesson of Europe for America? Is Europe making mistakes that we can avoid in America? In what ways is Europe a wholly different creature from the United States, or in what ways are we similar? And so he's constantly puzzling over these things, because he was what we would call a servant leader, and he wanted to serve the future of human happiness, particularly in the United States, but elsewhere too. And so a book like this just reminds you that Jefferson is unique amongst presidents of the United States. He's Leonardo da Vinci, who's also the president.
I was going to say, let's go to the interview, but before we do, I know that you would want to share with listeners that you do have a planned trip to France in the fall of 2022.
Indeed. Go to jeffersonhour.com. It's going to involve a couple of days, probably 3 in Paris, and then a number of days in the south of France. We'll go to Nîmes, where he saw the Maison Carrée, the building that inspired the Capitol at Richmond, and where he found other classical ruins and antiquities that really shaped his architectural aesthetic. And then he dipped over into Italy, and we're going to do that too. We're going to spend a day on the Canal de Midi, the famous canal that Richelieu built and where Jefferson spent 10 of the happiest days of his life, and so on. And so that's all coming. And this book, In Pursuit of Jefferson, will be a nice guide for me to try to prepare for this. We're changing the itinerary a little bit based upon Derek Baxter's research and insights. So that's coming up in the fall. And then there's an online course coming that I'm very, very excited about called The Enlightenment and Its Discontents. And we'll be reading 2 classics of the Enlightenment. Gulliver's Travels, one of the greatest books ever written. I can never say enough praise about this book. Candide by Voltaire, his anti-Enlightenment tract, really a novella, short, pessimistic novel about the Enlightenment. And then we'll be reading simultaneously Yuval Harari's magnum opus, Homo Deus, about his form of over-optimistic views of the human project in our time. So this will be a really fun course. People can find out details of it at jeffersonhour.com.
Yeah, I was going to say that's a lot to absorb in a moment, but do go to jeffersonhour.com to contact the show, support the show, or find out about all of these events in Clay's near future. And with that, sir, shall we go to the show?
Derek Baxter, In Pursuit of Jefferson, traveling through Europe with the most perplexing founding father. Let's go to the interview.
Good day, citizens, and welcome to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation about President Thomas Jefferson. And this week it is entirely about Jefferson, about President Jefferson and France. I'm your host, David Swenson, joined by the creator of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, Mr. Clay Jenkinson. And Clay, this week you had a one-on-one conversation with the author, Derek Baxter. In March, his book, In Pursuit of Jefferson, Traveling Through Europe with the Most Perplexing Founding Father. I must read this book, particularly after listening to your conversation. This must have been one you really enjoyed.
I'm taking a group of people to Jefferson's France in the fall, and I've done it once before. And so when I saw this title, I have one of those Google things that alerts you to anything on a certain subject. And so here it came, and I thought, okay, I ordered the book immediately. I got in touch with Derek Baxter. He was quite willing to be interviewed, and I read the book, which I loved. Fascinating account of his family's travel. So he is a lawyer. He lives in Fairfax, Virginia. His wife, Liana, and their children, Miranda and Nicholas, were with him on much of these European travels, and he tried to go into the exact footsteps of Thomas Jefferson and see what Jefferson saw and try to make sense of not only Jefferson by way of that travel, but of how the European world reshaped Jefferson's thinking during his 5 years there. So it was a great read, and it turned out to be a very fascinating interview.
I'm excited to share this interview with our listeners. Shall we go to it now, sir?
This is Derek Baxter, In Pursuit of Jefferson, traveling through Europe with the most perplexing founding father. I'm excited to have this chance to interview you. I'm a Jefferson scholar, so I'm also fascinated by the book for other reasons, and I'm going to Milan in November, much the same way you were, although I'm adding the Last Supper to my list of things I must see before they stop showing it altogether.
Absolutely. And Clay, I should start by saying that, yeah, I've long followed your career and read and listened to your stuff. And I actually heard you speak at Monticello at the Heritage Harvest Festival some years back,
right,
on farmers. Yes, I think we might have even met briefly cool. Then. So yeah, I've always been a big admirer. So it's I don't know who should be interviewing whom, but I'm definitely happy to talk with you.
Well, I know your story. In 4th grade, you portrayed Jefferson in a musical.
That's right.
Since you've never gotten him out of your system, you're having a quiet career, you have a family, and you decide to do this sort of crazy madcap journey. So what possessed you to do this?
I think, as you said, I was looking for something more. I was pushing 40 at the time, which actually now seems a little young, but at the time, it's pushing 40, what else are you going to do with your life? I wanted to, I had some dreams of travel, which I had always loved. And I wanted to reconnect with history and just a lot of those subjects out there. And Jefferson, as I wrote about in the book, I mean, Jefferson has always been kind of somebody I've admired for many reasons. And coming across his guide, just very revelatory. It's like, well, here's something this is what Jefferson wanted people to do back then. And it's what you could still do today. So it was madcap. I like that word. It was, I guess it was putting myself out there, but I thought this could just be a really great challenge and see what comes of it.
You're married and have a family, but as you know, Jefferson says traveling alone is the way to really ingest Europe.
Yeah.
How did you negotiate that issue?
That's interesting. Yeah, I did some of the trips by myself and some with the family, the majority with the family, but I did a couple of side trips off by myself. And that does give you the chance to meet people easier, I think, if you're traveling alone. But I will say traveling with other people, with close people, I think is also interesting because you can see not just how you're processing all these events, but how everybody is. And people saw things in my family in very different ways.
Were there Chevy Chase family vacations where they all just wanted to wring your neck?
The biggest would have been in England, where I decided I wanted to see all 19 gardens that Jefferson visited. I really, at the end of the day, I really kind of focused on about 3 or 4 or 5 of them in the book, but we went to all 19. Not all of them are still there even. And that was kind of the Chevy Chase moment, I guess, where we were driving all around, and sometimes, and it was hard to find some of these. I was looking at old maps and we'd show up to a couple of these places and they would just be like a scraggly meadow, or there'd be a little vestige of a garden that's now part of a prep school or something like that, which I got a lot of grief for after like all that work. Or the first one was a golf course. It wasn't even really a garden anymore. So yes, there was lots of different opinions about how useful that trip was. But for me, I really appreciate it because some of them are obviously amazingly preserved. Some are, some of the most famous gardens in the world. So contrasting those with other gardens, which might have been very impressive in Jefferson's time, and now there's almost nothing there, also I think was meaningful to me, just to see kind of the passage of time and how much work you have to put into preserving something. So I think that was worth it.
So if you went to all 19, I've been to 3 or 4 in my lifetime, and you might be the only Jeffersonian who's done this. That's a huge quest.
It was quite a quest, and some of them were hard. One was owned by the BBC, Caversham, which I was able, and I think they've sold it since I've been there. So that was really cool because it was hardly, they're not open for visitors, maybe once a year or something like that. But I got one of the radio hosts. I just found his email and emailed him, and he was friendly and just walked around, and he didn't know much about the garden either. He was just enjoying the trips. I mean, so there were some nice, very quiet moments like that for a few of the gardens. Or I write about this. The Lisos near Birmingham also is a garden, but a pretty modest one. But again, that we loved. And part of it for me was just, I couldn't believe that I was doing something that Jefferson, he did every one of those things. And so I think that was one of the fun parts of the trip for me. I never would have gone to the Lisos and to Reading and, places like that too. So that just got me off the beaten track, and just, that I think that's one of the joys of travel. If you have a purpose, if you have a reason for going somewhere, it doesn't have to be following Jefferson, but just whatever the reason, you've set up, it can just make it that more meaningful.
But, he was carrying Whately's English Gardens with him, and with his beautiful little minuscule hand writing in notes. Well, it's no longer laid out this way. They've changed this. This is not particularly aesthetically pleasing. And Adams is probably just sputtering. What are we doing here? I mean, how many gardens are enough? And Jefferson can't get enough of it. So when you're doing this, how does it help you think about Jefferson? He saw more than he was ever going to be able to accomplish here.
Well, I like what you said about Jefferson and Adams. They're different takes, right? Adams and Adams didn't quite go to all 19, but he went to a bunch of them. And right, for him, he's just like, exactly, why are we doing this? And he just was making fun of some of the owners. Jefferson was just very practical. It's such an interesting take on his travel, because he was certainly capable of, sometimes wrote these very lyrical descriptions of what he saw, but most of the time it's just jotting down the notes, like, here's, this temple looks good, the trees are here, the pond is here, because in his mind he's thinking about how he might recreate, like what's in it, what's in it for him and what's in it for other Americans like him who might want to do landscaping back home. But yeah, he took a lot of ideas. I mean, he had a lot of this from book learning. Obviously, he had Whately. He had even thought about landscaping before he went to Europe. But I think he took back some ideas, like the one for the ornamented farm, the Fair Monet, which he didn't fully put into practice. He probably also had ideas about the follies that he saw and kind of how he would combine everything and try to tell a story. And he didn't even wait till get back home. He started in the Hotel Langeac. He started in the garden behind it. He started, well, at least he sketched out plans to redesign his garden there. He just had 3/4 of an acre, but he wanted to just do as much as he can with whatever he had in front of him. So I have to think that seeing all these in person and rating them and figuring out which gardens he liked, fed into the vision he eventually had.
So he brings a ton of stuff back with him. This gigantic shopping spree that he went on, which is sort of appalling when you consider that he didn't really have any money to pay for all of that. He brings back architectural thought, and that has a gigantic influence in the course of American history. He brings back an understanding of wine and how the wine business works and how you can ship wines and so on. And that has a significant influence in American history. Gardening was a little less so because, and he admits, we're not quite there yet. We don't have enough wealth. We don't have enough luxury to incorporate these ideas, but he certainly wanted this kind of landscape aesthetic to be part of the American world too, didn't he?
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah. It wasn't fully realized. But he wrote in his guide and Hints to Americans Traveling in Europe, he wrote that gardening of the various arts is one that America actually could achieve quicker than, doing fine paintings, like you would see the old masters doing, because they have the plants. And he said, in fact, we've got the gardens. You just have to cut out the super abundant plants and the garden will emerge. Of course, it's a lot of work, and the work was being done in the South by enslaved people for sure. But he did want this aesthetic, and he had, I think, part of the aesthetic he brought back, and I think it might have been surprising for him to see plants like the tulip poplar from Virginia thriving in England and being part of the English garden, because the English gardens were putting on a show. They looked wild and it was nature, but it was all very composed. So I think he took back some of these ideas and became very excited about, which you can still see some of this at Monticello today. He had his roundabout paths, which he had started before he went to Europe, but he developed more afterwards. He had the contrast, which Margaret Bayard Smith, a visitor, I think in about 1809 or so, she noted that when you went up in the carriage to Monticello, it was going through the wild. The forest was savage, she put it. And then you emerged and you saw ordered fields and meadows. So that was part of, and you see the mountains. And so I think that's kind of the message that Jefferson was trying to show in part, that we can tame wilderness, that we have wilderness, that we should be proud of nature in America, but also that we can look to the West and we can tame the West. And, he had kind of an idea of the story he wanted to tell, but ultimately, and he was telling, other founders did as well with their gardens, but I think Monticello was such an interesting concept, especially being on the top of the mountain, which nobody else did. But again, he didn't fully realize this vision. I think he would have liked to have done even more with his landscaping.
You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, a one-on-one conversation between Clay Jenkinson and the author, Derek Baxter. We need to take a break, but we'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. This week's special one-on-one conversation between Clay Jenkinson and Derek Baxter. Derek talking about his new book, In Pursuit of Jefferson. And Clay, you begin this part of the conversation talking about the many journeys that Jefferson took while in Europe. And Baxter talks about how long it took to research his book.
And so Jefferson traveled a good deal during the 5 years that he was in Europe. Not only around France, the famous wine tour of 1787, that's the one that most of us know, with a little peep into Italy at the same time, what he called a peep into Elysium. But he also traveled to the Low Countries twice to meet with John Adams and with Dutch bankers. He went to England to work with Adams on some model treaties and to try to wrestle to the ground the problem of the pirates of Tripoli that were preying upon American shipping in the Mediterranean. And on one of his journeys, he came back through Western Germany. And so he was all over the map, really. And I have spent some time in the gardens of England where Jefferson took extensive notes and really just loved English gardening. He was carrying a copy of Thomas Whately's book on gardening with him and making annotations in it. And so I asked Derek about this. You'll hear his responses, but he and his family traveled to all 19 of the gardens of the famous houses, really. Think of Downton Abbey, of the famous houses and gardens that Jefferson loved in England, which I think is more than any other Jefferson scholar has ever done. I mean, that's a full load of Jefferson gardens.
Well, let's return to the conversation now, shall we, sir?
Indeed. This is a fascinating thing, and I want to go to some more of them next time I'm in England. The number of journeys that Jefferson undertook while he was abroad. There's the trip to England that we're talking about. There's the later trip to Amsterdam to try to get the loans extended and to make sure that before Adams left Europe, that Jefferson understood the exact negotiations that were needed. There's the famous trip, the wine trip in 1787, which takes him across the Alps, and so on. You decided to do all of it. That had to be that's a big leap. You're taking on expense and time with that, and the English trip is not that well known. The wine trip, of course, is superbly well known.
Yeah, it was a labor of love. It was kind of a crazy idea. Yes, I took it on. I did it over it took me 8 years on and off. The English trip was kind of a bonus because I was following what Jefferson put in his guide Hints, but the English trip he didn't put in Hints because he was writing it for two young travelers who were just going on the continent. But he talked about gardens in it, and he talked about English gardens being his favorite. It was one of the only things English that Jefferson truly loved. So I was thinking about just visiting some English style gardens in Italy and France. I was like, no, we should just go and do that as a bit of a bonus trip, which was I think a fun decision.
For me, there are two huge perplexities in Jefferson's 1787 trip. Number one, that he didn't go on to Rome and Naples and so on, because we just want him to continue down the spine of Italy. That's number one. And number two, as you point out in perplexity, why didn't he go see the Palladian villas when he was within a day or two of them?
Yeah.
And I know you have a theory of that, but you must have felt, oh, come on, let's go to Rome too.
Yeah, it must have been frustrating for Jefferson. And to give the context, in case everyone doesn't know, he was ambassador to France. He went to South. He took leave to go to Aix-en-Provence, ostensibly to take the hot waters there because he had broken his wrist. He thought soaking in the waters would help them. Of course, Jefferson got bored after a few days of soaking and quit the treatment. It was a bit of a pretext. He had wanted to go to the south of France even before that. And he also thought there could be some public benefit to his trip. He was going to investigate the different seaports in France, like Marseille and Bordeaux, and investigate, how could he help American commerce, which was his job. So he went down there and he was so close. He was obviously dying to go to Italy. He had grown up reading the classics, and the founders and that generation of America just idolized, of American leaders idolized the Romans, kind of like we do to some extent to the founders today. So he read Latin. He knew the stories. He even named his house after, with an Italian word. He even at one point he was growing vegetables and giving them Italian names. So of course he really wanted to go. He hit on and a reason to go to northwestern Italy to investigate the kind of rice they had, which was a legitimate reason, and I think related enough to his job as ambassador. He wanted to see if there was a different kind of rice that planters in the Carolinas could plant. So he had the justification to go. He thought all he had to do was to go right over the Alps. It turned out that the rice was grown further to the east, so he had to go all the way to Milan. And he wrote John Jay, his boss in effect, basically the foreign secretary under the Articles of Confederation. It kind of explained what he was doing, but he had already left. So he got to experience Italy for a few weeks, but no, as you say, Clay, he didn't go any further, and it must have killed him. I suspect he felt that he just couldn't justify time away from his trip, and from being in his job, which was to be in France. And once he had gotten the rice, he didn't have anything else he had to investigate. So you could only imagine Thomas Jefferson walking through the Roman Forum. And some of the travelers that followed Hintz back in 1788 did, and sent him letters and sent him books. And, this was the time of the Grand Tour when young aristocratic males, for the most part, would go there. And so there was a whole tourism industry set up, guides and a form of what we see today. So Jefferson would have thrived in that, but he didn't go. And nor did he go, as you say, to Vicenza, where Palladio had all those villas. A theory I have, I don't know if it's true or not, but a theory was that he didn't have the same burning need to go see Palladio anymore, because he was still Palladian, but he was starting to look more to 18th century French neoclassical architecture. That was his real model at that point, as opposed to Palladio's from a couple hundred years earlier. But at the end of the day, I think he just didn't have the time. So we're just kind of left with a what if.
But that Jefferson was capable of rationalizing this sort of thing, that if he'd gone to Rome, he would have said, it's essential as we begin our capitals in the country to know what the Romans have done and so on. Or that Naples gives us a glimpse into a world that was a Republican. There's no question that Jefferson would have figured out a way to build a narrative around it. And so you sort of have to feel respect for him for taking his job so seriously that he turned back. But remember, one of the key passages in his hints is, you ain't never going to get back. You better go see it now, because there was no chance Jefferson was going to go to Italy a second time. One of the things that led him to southern France was the obsession with canal building in the United States. And as you know, he and Washington could never get it done. The Great Potomac Canal, that was going to be the portal into the interior of the country. He went on that great excursion on the Canal de Midi, which was one of the happiest experiences of his life. And he then justified it by saying he's observing the locks, he's looking at the mechanisms. He actually, as you know, even gave advice to the lock keepers about how they could improve some of the mechanics.
That's very Jefferson, just showing up at the canal and then sketching out a better way of doing the locks. He did write those were some of the happiest days of his life. He had his carriage, he had it put on the boat, he had the wheels taken off it, so it was a little compartment he could stay in, but then he could just walk along the side of the canal, which is lined with plane trees. And he was just in his element. It was kind of all of the subjects that he enjoyed, he could do there. He could look into the science and technology of the canals. He could listen to the bird song. He was observing what he called the indexes of climate. So he could see, for example, he noticed that I think it was strawberries were coming into season on both ends of the canal, but not along the canal.
It's an amazing story. And he actually talked them into taking him up to see the works. There's a reservoir that feeds it. And he really found that to be enchanting.
It's amazing that Jefferson, he was kind of in the right place at the right time for a lot of these things, but that he observed things that others didn't, right? That he's remembered in the Canal du Midi, that he's remembered in Bordeaux, because he was one of the earliest to classify the wine there. There's so many different things that he just put his hand into and was able to kind of elevate the subject.
Let me ask a different kind of question. Yours was a journey story over a number of years, and a journey always has unexpected discoveries and revelations and reflections. And when I'm reading your book, and I reread it this weekend, we come to this moment where you grapple with slavery. And there's a disillusionment. There's a serious disillusionment with Thomas Jefferson that comes at the center of your book. And you give it more attention than it would have received 10 years ago, and certainly more than it would have received 25 years ago. So how do you negotiate as a lover of liberty, as a lover of Jefferson, the disillusionment when you realize how pathetic really his final responses were to slavery?
Yeah, that's a good question. And still a tough question, even though I've spent some time thinking about this, because it's not a secret, obviously, that Jefferson was a slave owner. And it was a disappointment to me. At first, I thought, well, this is a disappointment, but it's not going to be the main focus of my travels. It's all about the travels in Europe. That's what I wanted to do. So I gave it some attention, but not, to be frank, too much attention. But as I kept learning about these subjects for the travels, from architecture to landscaping to farming, everything kept coming back to slavery and to how he kept having all these dreams. The part that was inspiring me, like, oh, he invented a plow. He found this new food that we could bring, this new crop to bring back. He's developing a new architectural style, all this stuff that was just making this so enjoyable for me. I finally realized, well, all of this was dependent on enslaved labor and all of his travels. I mean, that was the moneymaker. It wasn't his salary with the government. It was tobacco. It was his role as a plantation owner, and just learning more and more about it, and seeing Jefferson as so visionary in so many areas. I did become very disillusioned with him, and just knowing that we expect more from him. And yes, of course, we're thinking to some extent we're looking, in 2022, looking backwards. And obviously we have different values, but some other enlightened planters of the time, white planters, had those values and did more. And Jefferson was in the vanguard of just about everything in America in terms of freedom of religion and promoting science and just expanding people's minds to ideas. And he wrote passionately as a younger man about how evil the institution of slavery was, yet he retreated. And worse for me, because I was focusing on this time of his life when Jefferson was in his 40s in France. And this is the time, I think, that he really retreated. And he didn't write about slavery for a variety of reasons. And even in his travels, he wrote almost to himself a note when he was in Nantes, which was a major slaving port in France, about the kind of rice that was being sold there for slave ships. It was almost like a note, like, remember, our planters might want to sell this kind of rice that would be sent off on slave ships. So he just knew it was wrong, and it became very disillusioning. And the more I thought about it, the more I felt at one point that I'm spending too much time raising Jefferson up, that everything I'm doing, even if it's somewhat critical of him at times, it's all coming back to him. And he wouldn't be in this kind of exalted place if it hadn't been for the 600 people he enslaved over his lifetime. So I wound up spending a lot more time trying to do work, learning the stories of some of the enslaved people, and not just how they related to Jefferson, but really how people lived in their own right and what are their own stories. And finally I was like, forget about Jefferson on this, because for a while I was still trying to relate what was the connection of, this enslaved person to Thomas Jefferson. But I wanted to just understand people, their own stories for their own value. And so I did some works and a little research and tried to explain some of the stories at Monticello of enslaved people who either left the plantation and found freedom or didn't, and just made the best of their lives, however they could. So it's a painful chapter for sure. And more than a chapter, because it's really part of the entire story of Jefferson's life. But it's one that we all, I think, as Americans, we all have to grapple with and think about.
You say something really important about that in that section of the book, which is that if you look at something as spectacular as UVA, or something as whimsical and droll as Poplar Forest, you have to always say, but wait a minute, the grounds were laid out at UVA by slaves, the bricks were baked by enslaved people, the timbers were cut by enslaved people. There were even artisans who had special talents who did the steps to the rotunda and so on. That when you were at UVA, I'm guessing you didn't think, look what slaves built. You thought, look what Jefferson gave us. But now our eyes have been opened in a way that we can't ever again close them. And we have to say Jefferson's achievement was unthinkable without slave labor. And it's so hard to get that sentence out of one's mouth.
No, you're right, Clay, and you put it very well. And at UVA, I was there in the early 90s, and I certainly thought of just Jefferson built UVA. And I'm sure the materials we all read back then talked about Jefferson building. He was our founder. There's much more of a reckoning, and I think UVA has done amazing work, and they have this beautiful memorial to enslaved laborers. Now, it reminds me a little of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. In a way, it's got the names of the people, the names that are known and many names that are unknown of enslaved people who worked at both building UVA and creating it. But yes, everything was done by Jefferson had the vision, and give him credit for that. But the work was all done by enslaved people and by some free whites at times as well. But so much done by enslaved people, and it was their hard work, and they suffered doing it. But not just that, as you said, there were artisans involved, and a lot of the touches were done by enslaved people using their own, artistry. So they are part of the story. They are the builders as well of all of these, World Heritage sites. Jefferson didn't get his hands dirty as much as you might think. He was out there, but he wasn't doing the hard work in his gardens. He would supervise and oversee, and he would measure things during construction of buildings. But it was really all these people, hundreds of people that mostly many enslaved that put it into practice.
You say astonishingly that as late as 1801, he admitted that he had never seen tobacco placed into a tobacco barrel.
That blew my mind when I saw that quote, because he said, I mean, it's time to beat up on Jefferson a little. I mean, he said there's not a sprig of grass that shoots uninteresting to me. He said he was just interested in the entire world, and he is. If you look at his travel journals, he's writing about everything, and this is the one subject that just becomes taboo, and that the actual mechanics of his enslaved people working on tobacco, it was beneath him or something. He did not get personally engaged in it. And farming was not his strong suit either. He was not a very successful planter. So yes, that kind of comes back as a disappointment. It's a disappointment that he missed a lot of Black culture going on at Monticello, which he didn't prize, and even the music being played. His younger brother was famous for actually attending, obviously enslaved people were almost always working, but they had some time to their own, mostly at night or on Sundays. They would sometimes have, fires and celebrations. And Jefferson's younger brother actually liked the music and hung out and listened to the music. Jefferson, he didn't go there. He still had a very Eurocentric view of things, and didn't, even though he wrote about the banjo in Notes on the State of Virginia, his only book, and this is actually one of the first published references to the banjo in America, he didn't explore it further. So another missed opportunity that he really didn't appreciate, I think, the culture, the lives of the people that he had enslaved.
Just to add quickly to that, not only his brother Randolph, but his daughter Martha was interested in the songs and the orchestrations and so on. And Jefferson made it clear he was not interested, that he looked on that as sort of, why would you want to go record any of that? And so there's a disappointment there. Maybe that is a psychological protection of himself in a way that his brother didn't share.
You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, a one-on-one conversation between Clay Jenkinson and the author Derek Baxter. We need to take a short break, but we'll be back in just a moment.
Welcome back to this special one-on-one edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, my interview with Derek Baxter, the author of In Pursuit of Jefferson, Traveling Through Europe with the Most Perplexing Founding Father. So Dexter and his family traveled to all these Jeffersonian places, and I've seen some of them, not all of them. In fact, I'm changing the itinerary of this coming Jefferson tour of France in the fall, thanks to the hard work that Derek Baxter did in his book. But here's what really perplexed me, the title, Traveling Through Europe with the Most Perplexing Founding Father. And I thought, well, in what sense? Well, it turns out that the issue of slavery and race has overtaken almost all of our conversations about Thomas Jefferson. In a sense, you can't talk about Jefferson anymore without factoring in the problematic issue of race and slavery. And so he actually gets, I wouldn't say gets stuck on this, but he spends a lot of time wrestling with this. And Jefferson went to Nantes, which was a place on the coast of France that was a slave trafficking site. And Jefferson is observing the harbors and so on, and he sort of offhandedly mentions slavery, but without any wrestling with the problem of slavery and race. And so that led to a long and very interesting chapter on race in this book. So that certainly came up in the interview, and I was fascinated by it. But he also talked about some of the most beautiful. I said, tell me about where you felt most Jeffersonian, where you felt you were in his footsteps. And he talked about these villages that are sort of hanging on the cliffs on the south of France and on the road to Italy, that just Jefferson thought were maybe the most beautiful villages in the world. Let's listen. There must have been a number of times on this journey where you just thought, man, I love this guy, or what a guy. Tell us a little bit about some of the great moments of just pure joy in traveling in his footsteps.
I love just some of the places, first of all, that he found on his trip. He loved this town of Séorge in France, which is tiny. It's in the Alps. And we spent a couple of nights there, and it was almost magical. And he described it in such beautiful terms. We just thought, I have to see Séorge. It's like it's almost on a cliff top. Everything's built out of stone, and the houses extend for several stories. And the houses are from the Middle Ages. So you have one family living on a bottom floor that exits here, and then further up on the cliff, another family exits here. And we stayed there. We hiked. We went into this clear mountain stream and swam around. The water was almost hurt. It was cold, even though it was in summer. And Jefferson described all this, and he described just the beauty of the place. He described, he also, of course, being Jefferson, he was being very practical. He was really into the olive tree, and he thought he wanted the olive tree to be brought back. And he thought that this could help poor farmers, that it didn't require much water. It could produce olive oil. So he just thought this was going to be a wonderful new find for America. So as he's traveling through the Alps to Séorge, he's charting the elevation. Okay, the olive tree can survive up until this height. So we were walking around and looking very unscientifically for olive trees. So that was a moment where I was just so happy to be on the trip and to be inspired by this Renaissance man who was just into everything. So that was just an amazing moment. Being in Amsterdam was another cool moment. I'd never been there. I'd been to some of these places in France before, in Italy, but I'd never been to Amsterdam. And again, Jefferson was just at the top of his game, I think, as a traveler in Amsterdam. He was walking through the streets. He heard a church bell playing some music, and he wrote down the musical notes. He was observing the canal bridges and the little innovations the Dutch had, and trying food and buying things. So that experience, my wife and I went for a festival there, and just that experience was, again, it was another bucket list experience that I wouldn't have had. It's so many, I could just go on and on. Going back to Provence was very meaningful. I had studied there my junior year abroad, and with my mother, we had gone up into the Luberon back then and gone to this little restaurant. We came back 20 years later, and the owner was still there. He even said, "I remember you," after I told him we had been there,
Wow.
which I find a little hard to believe.
Nice thing to say, no matter what.
Exactly. But we didn't care. The food was amazing. And this time I'm here 25 years, I think, later with my mother again, and this time with the kids. So they're experiencing something. I think going into these vineyards, that's such a direct connection to the past, because these are literally the same vineyards, and vines don't live 200 years, but they can live a long time. So we're seeing, and Jefferson rated these wines. So going to try some of those wines and develop my own palate, because I knew nothing about wine tasting. I thought it was kind of pretentious, and I fell in love with it. And just, that was also just such a fascinating experience. So many, that I give credit to him for kind of pushing us to go out there and do all these trips.
So in Paris, you go to the Palais Royal, you go to the Jefferson sites, his house, his hotels, and of course the statue of Jefferson looking off at the Hotel de Somme. What's your favorite Paris place for Jefferson?
Well, we loved the Marais district. I don't know that I don't necessarily know if that was Jefferson's favorite district, but we loved walking through there, and we actually stayed in a B&B, or kind of an inn, run by Well, it's the house of where Beaumarchais, the playwright, who Jefferson was a fan of and who helped the American Revolution cause quite a bit. Anyway, we stayed in that, which was kind of decked out in 18th century period furnishing. So that was amazing. We're going there and dining in the Grand Vefour. That has to be the place. That's a splurge. That's a once in a lifetime meal. This is a restaurant that in the Palais Royal. So the Palais Royal was kind of the pleasure district, as you know, in Paris at that time. That was the place to be. And Jefferson loved it. He went there a lot. And this is a restaurant that's hosted Napoleon and Victor Hugo and just many, the who's who throughout time. So anyway, going there with my wife and having this amazing meal and even talking to the waiters a little bit afterwards, which I don't think is normally done in fancy, Michelin star restaurants. It's all very super formal and white linen and all. But we even managed to chat with the waiter a bit at the end. I just thought that was an experience that Jefferson absolutely would have eaten up and probably had a very similar experience. And after that, we walked from the Palais Royal up to the Champs-Élysées where his house was and kind of looked at some of the sites along the way. And being Jefferson, of course, he actually counted, he counted how many steps it took him to get around in Paris. So I was even trying to count to see if my steps would match. Of course, there had been some wine involved at this restaurant. So I think my numbers were kind of off, but you could Jefferson just ate Paris up. I mean, he just, what a place for him. It was definitely a place that once he got used to it, because he got off to a rocky start, once he got used to it, it was just definitely the place for him to be, but also a place eventually for him to leave, because I think he wanted to come back to America, and he was just so proud of this new nation, this new republic, that he wanted to come back eventually with all this. He always knew he'd come back and he would help, build America up.
So many more questions I'd like to ask you. So I just want to note, when you finished that meal, you handed the bill to your wife. You couldn't bear to look at the cost.
No. I think she started to tell me later, and I was absolutely shocked. I still am. I mean, it all comes back to the same place, but it was quite a bit. But I think if there's any lesson from Jefferson, if you're near something, if it's a once in a lifetime experience, you should try to do it if you can. And so
the other restaurant that is in the Palais Royal that I take people to is the Mécanique, where the dumbwaiters were.
Okay.
Gone,
yeah.
But we know the site of it. And it's actually, I think that's where he first fell in love with the dumbwaiter. And it used to be a restaurant long after his time.
I would have loved to have gone there. And there's the Procope, and there's just, there's so many. And, most restaurants, I mean, it's rare for a restaurant to be in business for hundreds and hundreds of years, but so many of these buildings are old. So even if the restaurant itself is not that old, I mean, just all the architecture is, so you can get glimpses of Jefferson's time in Paris, if you know where to look.
So about the journals, when everyone who reads Jefferson's travel journals winds up being disappointed because he doesn't reflect on the purpose of life, or his own religious views, or how much he hates Hamilton, etc. It's very factual, the number of trellises for a vineyard, and how many fish they put in for fertilizer and so on. And yet there is this sort of other wonderful quality to the journals, because he's always asking about the people. Are they happy? Do these people look happy? And he would measure different places in France and said, here the women put little ornaments to show that they still are feminine, and here the women look like they're being borne down by too much labor. And and then he writes that famous letter to Lafayette saying, you got to get out there and you got to say you're tired, so they put you in their bed so you can see if they're soft. And there's this whole kind of beautiful side to Jefferson, saying the purpose of life is happiness, and he wanted to measure that, and what he saw really depressed him. And it led him to write those famous letters to Madison saying, got to tear up the Constitution every 19 years, and we got to cancel debts. And so he gets home in November of 1789 after this 5-year sojourn in Europe, and two things happen. The ship starts on fire in the harbor, and his 80-some crates of stuff are in danger of being burned up. Luckily, the fire's put out, and he discovers on shore that he's been made the Secretary of State.
It was quite a homecoming. Yes, his ship almost burned up, and I can only imagine what was going through his head, especially because he had all these great dreams for America, and he had just been in the capital of the world, in effect, Paris, and now he's back. He's in Tidewater, Virginia, he landed at a place very close to where I think a woman had been tried for witchcraft 100 years earlier. So all of a sudden he's there, and now his ship is on fire. So I wonder if he was thinking, what have I got myself back into? And then he gets this job, which seems like it was a promotion, but it wasn't really what he wanted at that time. And he didn't really understand what the Secretary of State what the position was going to be. So he probably had a lot of mixed views and mixed emotions when he first landed. But that was the end of his European adventure. He never made it back. He did some other travels. His longest trip was the 1791 trip to New England with James Madison, which is also very interesting. But that was it as a traveler. But he came back with a love of travel. And he certainly, more than any other president, he kept buying maps and books on travels. And he obviously commissioned Lewis and Clark, which gets back to your expertise, Clay. But all of that, I think, was in the Louisiana Purchase. All of this, a lot of the genesis of these ideas comes from his time in Europe. So he continued to travel, I think, even if he wasn't physically going on the trips himself.
And just the two psychological possibilities for our next conversation. I agreed with you entirely that Captain Ramsey wanting to bring Sally Hemings back to the United States creeps me out in every possible way. And I think Abigail Adams saw through that and made sure that she was safe. But sexual predation, we have to wonder about that with Jefferson, but I think Ramsey's ideas were probably corrupt. And then when Jefferson gets back, within 2 months, his daughter Martha is married to her cousin. There's a lot going on there that we don't know. And so there's lots about Jefferson's inner soul and workings and heart and consciousness and id and blindnesses that we simply don't know.
Yes, so much of it is hidden because he wouldn't put it on paper. And there's hardly any references to the Hemingses in his personal letters. So, there's a suspicion that they might have been burned or changed, omitted later. Annette Gordon-Reed, the groundbreaking professor at Harvard, she's talked about this quite a bit. And you're right, both of those instances are just, we get glimpses and we don't fully know what was going on. The first one being, as you mentioned, with Sally, Captain Ramsey brought Sally Hemings, I think she was 15, to be the enslaved servant of Jefferson's daughter. They get to London and they're going to send Polly over to Paris, and Captain Ramsey very eagerly says, well, I'll bring this young girl back with me. So that seemed inappropriate, to say the least. This unmarried ship captain was going to bring this enslaved girl back unsupervised.
Beautiful young girl.
Yes. And then Jefferson's daughter Martha married very quickly, as you point out, just a couple of months after she returned to Paris to Thomas Van Randolph, who she had seen as a child and had not seen very much. And there's the question, is this a psychological reaction to her father and Sally Hemings? We don't know. There's so much that's not known. It's certainly a possibility. Certainly a lot of the emotions are going on just under the surface, so that we can't fully know today. But Jefferson wrote so much on everything and saved so much. He was always writing for history, and his family knew. They knew he was the guy, and that people will be looking at these letters for centuries, as they have. So he is our best source on so many things, including on the lives of the enslaved people. I mean, he's the best source of what the material life was like for enslaved people at a plantation in the 18th century and early 19th. So if he's got the data, but kind of the why is still kind of under the surface sometimes, in the emotion. So you try to understand things at a human level the best you can, but then we're left guessing sometimes.
Derek, thank you for all this time. I certainly appreciate it. Congratulations on this book. I hope it does very, very well.
Well, thank you, Kelly. Thanks. And thanks for all your work. You've certainly been an inspiration as well. Appreciate it.
See you another time. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Clay, thank you so much for sharing these conversations with myself and all of our listeners. I am enjoying very much listening to them. I look forward to more of them.
Almost everyone we asked to interview now for the Jefferson Hour is willing to do it, thanks largely to the new technologies that have emerged, or at least been highlighted since the pandemic took over our lives. And I know you've got a couple of gigantic projects more in line with your traditional work that are keeping you from some of these interviews. I always miss you on them, but I'm glad that we get a chance to talk about them before we air them.
Yes, one project in particular is something I've been wanting to do for decades. That is just a joy to be working on. I'm very excited about it.
This involves Native American sound from the turn of the 20th century.
Careful, or we'll end up talking for a long time. But if people are interested, we have just what's called a splash page at the beginning of a permanent website. It's Lakota Songs, all one word, .com. And if you go there, there's a video and some information about what we're up to, and it's very exciting.
We'll be doing an interview with you about that project here shortly, but it's fascinating, and it's about the kind of work that you've been at now for, I suppose more than 30 years, but listening with deep respect and humility to Native American voice. And I know of no one who could do a better job of this than you, and I congratulate you on it.
Well, thank you for that, but really, the subject we should be discussing is this week's interview with Derek Baxter. I got to read this guy's book after listening to him. He sounds like just a very fine and fun fellow. Thanks so much for sharing this interview, Clay, and look forward to more in the weeks to come.
Derek Baxter, in Pursuit of Jefferson, traveling through Europe with the most perplexing founding father. We'll see you all next week for another important edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
The Thomas Jefferson Hour is brought to you each week by Dakota Sky Education. The program is distributed nationally by Prairie Public. President Thomas Jefferson lived from 1743 to 1826, and this program presents his views. President Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author Clay S. Jenkinson. To obtain a copy of this or any show for a $12 donation, please call 701-575-0727. This program is also available online at jeffersonhour.com and on Apple Podcasts. If you'd like to correspond with President Jefferson or submit a question for him to answer on the program, please visit the website at jeffersonhour.com. The Thomas Jefferson Hour is produced at Makoche Recording Studios in Bismarck, North Dakota. Bach Cello Suite No. 3 in C Major by Stephen Swinford. Thank you for listening. Please tune in again next week for another thought-provoking, historically accurate program through the eyes of Thomas Jefferson.